Okay, this is the third episode of Eisenhower, and it deals with Eisenhower, the last part of how we get in Vietnam, and Eisenhower and his dealings with the Soviet Union, especially with Nikita Khrushchev. Now, most people today, when we look at America's involvement in Vietnam, the first thing from this section I need you to understand is that it's during Eisenhower's administration we get involved. At first, we're just sending advisors and individuals like that, but as we go from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson, and then finally to Nixon, it's not until Richard Nixon is in the office that we start. As a matter of fact, Nixon campaigns on getting us out of Vietnam. We'll talk more about Vietnam when we get to Kennedy and Johnson's administration. But for right now, the whole point, one of the biggest questions, is why do we even get involved? Why do we even get ourselves involved in this thing? And the idea we have to come to grips with is because of NSC 68. NSC 68, George Kennan's doctrine of containment, starts off with the statement, if we do nothing, then all the nations of the world start falling like dominoes. The Soviet Union will start causing all these nations to fall like dominoes. And so what we need to focus on is the big question as to why. Most people look at Vietnam as this terrible, terrible thing that happened that we had no business being involved in. But in fact, there were reasons we were there, and big part of it was NSC 68, and the second big part of it was South Vietnam were our allies. And they were being attacked by the North Vietnamese. And so we had, according to the Eisenhower administration, necessary cause, necessary reason to be involved, since the Soviets and the Chinese communists were assisting North Vietnam. Okay, so the big question is why? Why do we get involved? Everybody's assessment. Well, during the Eisenhower administration, your textbook talks about this concept of nation building. In 1954, when asked, the State Department is asked, what are our chances of success in Vietnam? The State Department says, we don't have a chance of success in Vietnam. Well, they say Ho is far too popular, ZM is far too controversial, and the South, they're far too weak. The French, when the French occupied South Vietnam, they made sure that the South Vietnamese army was not able to rise up and oust them. They were poorly equipped, they were poorly trained, they were poorly manned. So when we arrive, we have to start trying to build and train the South Vietnamese army to make them an effective fighting force. Hence the reason we're sending mostly advisors and trainers at this period. Okay? Even anti-communists in South Vietnam don't like the look of Westerners coming in to control Vietnam. They've had enough of French occupation. Many of the anti-communists in South Vietnam don't even want the American occupation to take place. Okay? When the Joint Chiefs of Staff are asked about our chances of success in Vietnam, they say it's hopeless, utterly hopeless. We don't have a chance. The Defense Secretary, Wilson, says he sees nothing but grief if we remain in this area. If we remain in Vietnam, he sees nothing for grief but for our country. Allen Dulles, we have a 1 in 10 chance of success in Vietnam. So why? Why do we go? If all of these, everybody who would be in charge of our involvement in this conflict in another country, if they all believe everything is completely hopeless, why do we go? We go because of NSC 68. that doctrine of containment. If we do nothing, Vietnam falls without a question. We have to do something, is what the philosophy is. Even if it's doomed to failure, we have to do something. Dulles to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he says, we must put up a good stout effort, even though it is by no means certain that we will succeed. We do know that if we do nothing, South Vietnam will fall. Okay? A few promising things had happened in our nation-building exercise. For example, the coups in Guatemala and Iran, where we've installed governments that were friendly to the United States and not communist. So we've gotten some positive influence. But then on the 22nd of October, I'll see if I can find this speech, because this is one of the televised speeches from Eisenhower. Eisenhower comes on the television and he announces to the general public why we are going. And he tells America that this is, we are going in here, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard for us. But then he makes this one statement, which it still just sort of boggles my mind. He says, even though we are going in here in such a position where we feel handicapped, he says, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. You get the picture? You see what he's talking about? He's like, clearly we are at a disadvantage, but again, if we don't do something, then we know what will happen to South Vietnam. Now, the French believe that Bao Dai is the only hope to save Vietnam, the old crown prince. Secretary Dulles replies that if that's the case, then we truly must be very desperate. And then Ambassador Heath says there is no one to take his place who would better serve U.S. interests than Bao Dai along with Diem. The United States forces France to accept Diem, even though Diem is he's very, very a Francophobe. He does not like the French at all. And then in fall 1954, the U.S. helps Diem foil the first coup attempt on his life. And with this, we sort of solidify his control of Vietnam. What I wanted us to see is this idea that that Eisenhower is the one who starts involving us in Vietnam, and so our involvement in Vietnam goes all the way back to the 1950s, contemporary with our involvement in Korea. Okay, I've got some pictures. One of the things we do during Eisenhower's administration, Diem's brother is the Roman Catholic cardinal for the country of Vietnam. North Vietnam starts persecuting Catholics. Communist nations are virulently anti-religious. And so the U.S. is going to send ships into North Vietnam to help evacuate 900,000 Catholics out of North Vietnam to bring them to South Vietnam. I've got some pictures here. I hope you can see them. If you can't, you can download the PowerPoint. Again, we've got Eisenhower here with I keep missing the guy's name. Dulles, right? John Foster Dulles. Dulles is the Secretary of State. Welcoming Diem to the country. Normally, Diem wears double-breasted white suits, but he was told that Eisenhower always wore gray suits, and so Diem actually has a gray suit made so he can wear. You'll see the white suits here in a second. There they are at the airport, where there's Star Spangled Banner, the two national anthems of the countries, since South Vietnam is our ally. This is a family portrait of the Diem family. Here is Diem himself. Here's his older brother, the Archbishop, and then of course there's the grandmother, and then here is this is Nguyen Thu, who's Ziem's Thu Ziem. It's his brother. He becomes the head of the secret police during this time period, and then of course Ziem's wife, who will be referred to by the French as the Dragon Lady, of Vietnam. Very interesting characters here. Now, let's see, who else we have? This is from the Kennedy administration when LBJ goes to visit Vietnam. LBJ is a very tall man. He's well over 6 feet tall. Normally, when you see LBJ, you can tell what his attitudes towards you are based on his posture. If he's kind of leaned back, then he thinks of you as somebody who's not a threat, possibly even someone he might even have respect for if he's sort of in this laid-back posture. If he's straight up and down and he looks at you as an equal, right? But if he perceives you as a threat or as someone who is weak, then what he does is he kind of towers over the top of people and does this kind of thing so that they feel intimidated. And you can see that in almost all the pictures of FDR when he's dealing with foreign dignitaries, because those are the kinds of things that you're doing. Just pick it up and close it. And of course this is Henry Cabot Lodge, who's coming, and there's Ziem to actually he's bringing information that would tell U.S. forces that the United States is going to allow for a coup. Okay, now Eisenhower and the Russians. In this picture, you've got Richard Nixon. One thing I like about this picture, Khrushchev brings his entire entourage to the World's Fair. This is Nikita Khrushchev. This guy here is a guy named Brezhnev. It's during Kennedy's presidential administration that he has to deal with Brezhnev, because Brezhnev is the one who's going to replace Khrushchev. Now, this is normally referred to by historians as the kitchen debate. Nixon is trying to show Khrushchev how everything is so much better in our industrialized America, and Khrushchev is basically saying, we have these things. We have all these things in the Soviet Union. And they're having this debate, they're having this discussion over the conflict between capitalism and communism, which is really a fairly well-researched piece of information here with these guys, Nixon and Khrushchev. You have to remember that Nixon was the guy who was with McCarthy. Nixon was one of the guys who was hunting down communists in the country. Okay, so this little dialogue between Nixon and Khrushchev was supposed to show Khrushchev that Eisenhower is interested in sort of a dialogue, and which he was. Eisenhower is very interested in a dialogue, especially over nuclear arms. In the Truman administration, the plan was to build as many atomic bombs as possible, and once the hydrogen bomb was developed, we start building hydrogen bombs as quickly as possible. Then all of a sudden we find out that the Soviets have atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs, and they start building them. So there is this arms race, and we are constantly testing these new bombs all over the place. Khrushchev is much more moderate than Stalin, okay? At least privately, one-on-one. Publicly, Khrushchev understands the politics, the theater of politics. Publicly, Khrushchev is a hardliner. You'll see Khrushchev at the floor of the United Nations pounding on a table with his with a shoe, telling the Western nations, "We will crush you. We will crush you like bugs, and he's smashing it on the podium as if he were smashing cockroaches. But then later, the photograph of Khrushchev leaving the United Nations that day shows him wearing both his shoes, and he's got the prop shoe under his arm. He's carrying the prop shoe out because it was theater. Khrushchev is during the Battle of Stalingrad, was the propaganda minister during World War II of Stalingrad. Khrushchev understands the theater of politics, okay? So, he is more moderate than Stalin. He will sign a peace treaty with the Austrians, and the Soviets will even remove their troops. Remove the troops from Austria, allowing Austria to govern itself. Okay? In 1955, he meets with Eisenhower, and it was a positive meeting, very positive meeting. And then in 1959, he comes to the United States to this World's Fair, and then Nixon is sent to the Soviet Union, and Nixon goes on a goodwill tour to meet with the Soviets in Russia. Okay? By 1960, early 1960, there is a chance that the two superpowers who have nuclear weapons are going to sign a ban on testing these nuclear weapons any further. And so Eisenhower is really excited about it. He's so excited he even cancels the spy plane missions over the Soviet Union because we're constantly spying. And we've got these special kind of planes called the U-2 plane. The U-2 planes fly so high up in the atmosphere that we believe that the Soviets can't even see these planes. They have massive cameras on them, and we're taking pictures of all of this territory where we know they have nuclear facilities, these missile sites throughout the country. And so Eisenhower is so excited about the opportunity to do this that he cancels the U-2 flights following the announcement that they're going to have this meeting. So what happens? Well, it's a day late and a dollar short. Not only did the Soviets have the technology to see the U-2 planes, they actually had the technology to shoot one down. And so one of the U-2 planes, on the 1st of May, 1960, a U-2 plane is shot down over Soviet territory. The State Department thought that the pilot, Gary Powers, Francis Gary Powers, we believed he was dead because to be shot down from such a high altitude, that was, there's probably no way he could have survived that. And so we deny all wrongdoing. These U-2 planes don't have any markings. The pilots have no identification on them, not even dog tags. They don't have any markings on their uniforms. These are spy planes, okay? So then the Soviets produce the plane, and we say, that's a nice looking plane. We don't know anything about it. Then they produce the pictures that the plane was taking. Those are great pictures. Think we could get a look at them? And then they produce Powers, and he's alive. And then the State Department has to say, oh, that Francis Gary Powers. Now, Francis Gary Powers graduated from Milligan College. He graduated from Milligan College. Well, just a little tidbit there before he goes off to the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy. Now, so they produce Powers. Okay, Eisenhower says, all right. Yes, we were sending spy planes over your territory, but you're sending spy planes over our territory. He refuses to apologize because he says we're doing exactly the same thing that you're doing. However, as far as the theater of political affairs, this kind of thing, Eisenhower gets a black eye. It makes the Russians look like the victims in this thing, okay? It dashes any hopes for a nuclear test ban because Khrushchev gets the mileage out of this that he needs. He goes before the United Nations and he pounds on the podium and he demands that this imperialistic acts against his freedom-loving country of Soviet Union stop. And then in a sort of a sideways slap, He demands that the city of Berlin become a free and independent city under Soviet control. Well, once all this happens, our nuclear buildup starts in earnest. We start expanding our nuclear arsenal. There's nothing that Eisenhower can do, because once this happens, the Congress, the people in charge of our military-industrial complex, are going to say, you see, we have to continue. And they keep their buildup. Now, here's a couple pictures of a U-2. Like I said, the only markings on it are basically just the tail number of the plane, so you can see how it lands. Here's a picture of Powers in his U-2 plane. Again, his uniform. They don't even have nicknames stenciled across their helmets like you see on the movies. Okay? When he's captured, this is where he's shot down. It takes off in Pakistan, and we land in Norway. He flies over this region where this this site for the missile site is, but it's there. They also have the air defense missiles, and they shoot down the plane. This is a site of the wreckage. Here they're showing Khrushchev the parts and how these guys know that these parts come from the United States, because the internal parts are all basically, they have all their tags on them from where they're made, what their serial number is, and all that kind of stuff. And so Khrushchev is informed. So this next time he meets with Eisenhower, he points his little grubby finger at Eisenhower and says, you've been spying on us, and we've got the plane. There in the Moscow Museum is actually Gary Powers' actual parachute and the camera that was taken from the U-2 spy plane that was used to take pictures of the Soviet Union. Powers is going to be put on trial. They stick him in a civilian suit. He's being tried as a spy, since the uniform was not a military uniform. And if you want to watch an interesting movie, actually this is going to take place as we get closer to the Kennedy administration. Well, this is 1960. Kennedy's getting ready to be elected. There is a film with Tom Hanks called The Bridge of Spies. Very, very interesting movie. And if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've seen it. If I'm not mistaken, part of the thing that this lawyer sent to the Soviet Union to negotiate is the release of Gary Powers. An attempt at a trading of spies. We'll trade one of your spies for our spy, kind of a scenario. But the Soviets are going to use this as a big propaganda tool and put him on the air. Now, the arms race. By the time Ike leaves office, instead of a nuclear test ban, our stockpile of nuclear weapons increases 4 times. We install 72 intercontinental ballistic missiles in the United States and Britain, and we are ready to deploy more to NATO allies in Italy and Turkey. We are planning these intercontinental ballistic missiles all over the area. Okay, hundreds more are under contract, and then in November 1960, the first Polaris missile is launched. A Polaris missile is a missile that's launched from a submarine, but it can be launched while the submarine is still underwater. I got a picture too. This is what freaks us out, because in August 1957, we are behind the times. The Soviets test their own ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. That means a missile that goes so high it can just travel in the upper atmosphere and then just drop down wherever, almost without notice. Okay, and then in October they launched the Sputnik. The Sputnik is the first satellite launched from the Earth that makes it outside the atmosphere. Sputnik, and it was a really amazing device, the Sputnik satellite. Do you know what the Sputnik did? This is what the Sputnik did. The Sputnik circled the Earth and went beep, 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 beep. Why is that important? Because the signal was receivable on the Earth from outside the atmosphere. Which means if you can receive a signal from outside the atmosphere, then you should be able to send a signal, possibly a launch code or triggering device. So even though the space race, as we're going to call it, to attempt to get in outer space, the Soviets make it into space first, the military application, again, everything is Cold War. Everything is focusing. Even NASA, even the space race is dealing with the Cold War. Okay, so it's in Eisenhower's administration that NASA is created, and the Civil Defense Administration. The Civil Defense Administration. They're supposed to coordinate civilian defense and how to shelter, how to do bomb shelters, and all kinds of information necessary in case an atomic bomb is dropped. I'm going to put a little video, a YouTube video on the page, one of my favorite civil defense films. It's called Duck and Cover. You should enjoy it. Here's a couple pictures of Polaris missiles being launched from the submarines that are underwater. This is an old diesel submarine that's being retrofitted to hold Polaris missiles. And then here is the big Trident submarines that are designed to hold. You can hardly see it here, but each one of these little indents, that's where Polaris missiles. Each Polaris missile can carry a nuclear warhead. Here's a picture to give you some scope of the size. So what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14 atomic bombs can be carried in each one of these submarines that can go under the ice pack and then just surface. And while underwater, they can launch these atomic bombs anywhere they want to. Here's a picture of Sputnik, the launch pads of the Soviet, the cosmonauts were, the launch pads were out in open water, and then they would land on land. And we did ours the exact opposite, probably because we just wanted to be opposite. And then, of course, the symbol for the civil defense, the fallout shelter. When I went to school at Henry Johnson in Johnson City, outside the doors, the back doors, right next to where the kindergarten was, there were these big civil defense signs hung up, because in the basement of all of these inner city schools, we keep repurposing these schools in Johnson City because essentially they were built to be bomb shelters, fallout shelters. The only way to tear those buildings down is to probably use dynamite to dig some way underneath them and explode them from underneath. So they just keep repurposing these old buildings because they just don't have the cost to tear them down would be so extreme. But we're afraid in the country. This is a big part of the Cold War. This idea that at any moment books are written. Much of the film and of the Cold War is dealing with the threat of nuclear war, the constant threat of nuclear war. And after you watch Duck and Cover, I want you to keep this part of that in mind. The film that I'm going to show you is what we showed the 3rd, 4th, 5th graders. This is what the kids in elementary school are shown to help them understand what their responsibilities when the atomic bomb is dropped in your neighborhood. Okay? And so what are we afraid of? We're afraid of that guy, Nikita Khrushchev. You can see the big hydrogen mushroom cloud in the back, and then the first atomic bomb. So this ends our section on the Eisenhower administration. If we could have, I would have liked to have done more, because also the civil rights movement is going to also begin during the Eisenhower administration. I had another film that I used to like to show called The Untold Story of Emmett Lewis Till, but we'll try to get back to it on another video. So we'll see you guys later.